The year was 1692, and Captain William Mitchell was about to witness something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As his merchant vessel approached the familiar harbor of Port Royal, Jamaica, he noticed something was terribly wrong. The bustling pirate haven that had been there just days before was gone. Not abandoned, not destroyed by cannon fire, but literally swallowed by the earth itself. In less than 3 minutes, an entire city had vanished beneath the waves, taking with it thousands of souls and secrets that remain buried to this day. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of natural disaster. This is a story of how the wickedest city on earth met its apocalyptic end, and why some believe it wasn't just nature that sealed its fate. The events of June 7th, 1692, defy everything we think we know about earthquakes and their aftermath. Buildings didn't just collapse, they liquefied. Streets turned into quicksand. And most mysteriously of all, the sea itself seemed to reach up and drag the city down into its depths. But here's where this story gets truly unsettling. Multiple eyewitnesses reported phenomena that science still struggles to explain. Ships anchored in the harbor described the water literally boiling around them. Survivors spoke of the ground moving like ocean waves, creating a nauseating sensation that made even seasoned sailors violently ill. And perhaps most disturbing of all, many claimed to hear the city's church bells ringing beneath the water for days after it sank. Port Royal wasn't just any Caribbean settlement. By 1692, it had earned the notorious title of being the richest and most depraved city in the New World. Pirates, merchants, slaves, and fortune seekers from across the globe had converged on this Jamaican peninsula, creating a powder keg of wealth, violence, and moral corruption. The city's taverns never closed, its brothels never emptied, and its streets ran red with both blood and Spanish gold. The wealth flowing through Port Royal was staggering even by today's standards. Conservative estimates suggest that the equivalent of billions of modern dollars worth of treasure passed through its markets annually. Henry Morgan, the infamous Welsh privateer, had made it his headquarters after his devastating raids on Spanish settlements. The city's merchants grew fat on the proceeds of piracy, while its craftsmen melted down stolen silver and gold into untraceable ingots. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost. Contemporary accounts describe Port Royal as a place where human life held little value. Duels were fought daily over card games and insults. Public executions were treated as entertainment. The slave markets operated with brutal efficiency, treating human beings as mere cargo. Religious leaders of the time proclaimed it a modern Sodom and Gomorrah, predicting divine retribution for its sins. The morning of June 7th started like any other in Port Royal. The harbor buzzed with activity as merchant vessels unloaded their exotic cargo. Street vendors hawked their wares to sailors flush with coin. Children played in the narrow streets while their parents conducted business in the shops and taverns that lined every block. Nobody suspected that they were living through the final hours of their city's existence. At approximately 11:43 in the morning, the first tremor struck. Witnesses described it as a gentle rolling motion, similar to the sensation of being aboard a ship in calm seas. Many residents initially dismissed it as nothing more than the aftereffects of the previous night's revelries. The city's population, accustomed to the occasional minor earthquake common to the Caribbean region, continued about their daily business largely unbothered. But within minutes, the gentle rolling transformed into something far more sinister. The second shock wave hit with devastating force, causing buildings to sway violently and sending residents stumbling into the streets. Contemporary accounts describe the sound as apocalyptic, a deep rumbling that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth itself. Dogs began howling in terror, horses reared and bolted, and even the most hardened pirates felt their blood run cold. Then came the third and most catastrophic wave. This wasn't just an earthquake in the traditional sense. The very ground beneath Port Royal began to behave like liquid, a phenomenon modern geologists call liquefaction. The sandy soil that the city was built upon, saturated with seawater and destabilized by the seismic activity, transformed into a flowing quicksand that swallowed everything in its path. Reverend Emmanuel Heath, one of the few educated witnesses to survive the disaster, provided perhaps the most detailed account of what happened next. He described watching entire buildings tilt and slide into the earth as if they were ships sinking into water. The ground opened up in massive chasms that would swallow a building whole, then snap shut again with crushing force. People who had been walking on solid pavement one moment found themselves neck-deep in liquefied sand the next. The most horrifying aspect of the disaster was its selectivity. Some buildings collapsed entirely, while others simply tilted at impossible angles and remained standing. Certain streets vanished completely, while others suffered only minor damage. Survivors reported seeing friends and family members disappear into the earth, only to watch helplessly as the ground closed over them like the surface of a pond. But the earthquake was only the beginning of Port Royal's nightmare. As the ground continued to heave and buckle, the sea itself began to behave in ways that defied natural explanation. Massive waves, some reaching heights of over 60 feet, began crashing over the sinking city. These weren't ordinary tsunamis triggered by the earthquake, but rather a series of seemingly coordinated assaults by the ocean itself. Captain Mitchell, whose ship was anchored just outside the harbor, witnessed something that would haunt maritime folklore for centuries. He reported seeing the water around Port Royal turn a deep crimson color, as if the sea itself was bleeding. Other ship captains corroborated this account, describing the water as having the consistency of thick soup and an overwhelming stench of sulfur and decay. Even more disturbing were the reports of supernatural phenomena that accompanied the disaster. Multiple witnesses claimed to see ghostly figures walking through the chaos, apparently unaffected by the destruction around them. Some survivors swore they heard voices calling out in languages they didn't recognize, while others reported seeing strange lights dancing above the sinking city. The speed of Port Royal's destruction was perhaps its most remarkable aspect. In less than 3 minutes, 2/3 of the city had disappeared beneath the waves. An area covering nearly 200 acres, containing over 2,000 buildings and home to more than 6,000 residents, simply vanished from the face of the earth. The death toll was catastrophic, with conservative estimates suggesting that over 5,000 people perished in those brief moments of terror. Among the casualties were some of the Caribbean's most notorious pirates and privateers. Captain Jack Ward, known for his brutal raids on Spanish treasure fleets, was reportedly crushed when his favorite tavern collapsed on top of him. The infamous pirate Queen in Jouvut vanished along with her entire crew, their ship swallowed by a massive whirlpool that opened up in the harbor. But perhaps the most tragic losses were among the city's slave population. Chained in the lower levels of merchant warehouses and unable to escape the rising waters, hundreds of enslaved people drowned in the darkness below the city. Their bodies, along with untold treasures and secrets, remain buried beneath the Caribbean waters to this day. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, survivors faced a nightmare landscape of death and devastation. Those fortunate enough to escape the initial destruction found themselves stranded on a rapidly shrinking piece of land, surrounded by debris-filled waters and the bodies of the less fortunate. The air was thick with dust and the smell of death, while the few remaining buildings creaked ominously, threatening to collapse at any moment. Rescue efforts were hampered by the continuing aftershocks and the fear that the rest of the peninsula might follow the city into the sea. Ships that attempted to approach the disaster area reported that their compasses spun wildly, making navigation nearly impossible. Several rescue vessels ran aground on debris that hadn't been there hours earlier, forcing their crews to abandon their missions and flee to safety. The survivors' accounts of their experiences in the days following the disaster are filled with reports of strange phenomena that continued long after the earthquake had ended. Many claimed to hear the sound of church bells ringing beneath the water, particularly during the early morning hours when the wind was calm. Others reported seeing lights moving beneath the surface of the water at night, as if the sunken city was somehow still alive below the waves. Modern scientific expeditions have attempted to explain these mysterious reports, but many questions remain unanswered. Underwater archaeological surveys have located portions of the sunken city, confirming that it lies preserved beneath layers of sand and coral on the ocean floor. However, the layout of the ruins doesn't match historical maps of Port Royal, suggesting that the city's destruction was even more chaotic and complete than previously believed. Recent diving expeditions have made some remarkable discoveries in the underwater ruins. Perfectly preserved bottles of wine, still sealed and containing liquid, have been recovered from what were once the city's taverns. Skeletons have been found in positions that suggest some victims were buried alive in the liquefied sand, their final moments frozen in time for over 3 centuries. Perhaps most intriguingly, underwater photographers have captured images of what appear to be architectural features that don't match any known building style from the period. These anomalous structures have led some researchers to speculate that Port Royal may have been built on top of a much older settlement, one that was also destroyed by some ancient catastrophe. The mystery deepens when we consider the earthquake's unusual characteristics. Modern seismologists have studied the geological evidence from the 1692 disaster and found several puzzling inconsistencies. The pattern of destruction doesn't match what would be expected from a typical earthquake, and the liquefaction effects were far more extensive than the magnitude of the tremor should have produced. Some scientists have proposed that Port Royal was destroyed by a phenomenon known as a slow earthquake, where the energy is released over a longer period, causing more sustained ground motion. Others suggest that the city's location on a narrow peninsula made it particularly vulnerable to seismic amplification effects. However, none of these explanations fully account for all the observed phenomena. The most controversial theory suggests that the disaster wasn't entirely natural. Some researchers point to historical records indicating that the Spanish had been conducting experiments with explosive devices in the region, possibly attempting to destroy the pirate haven through artificial means. While there's no definitive proof of such a plot, the timing and unusual characteristics of the disaster have kept this possibility alive in academic circles. Today, the site where Port Royal once stood is a shadow of its former self. The modern town bearing the same name sits on what remains of the original peninsula, home to a small fishing community and a modest naval base. The contrast between the current quiet settlement and the legendary wickedness of its predecessor couldn't be more stark. Yet the sea hasn't finished telling its story. Every few years, storms and changing currents expose new artifacts from the sunken city, washing them up on nearby beaches like messages from the past. Coins bearing the faces of long-dead kings, pieces of jewelry that once adorned pirate captains, and fragments of ships that sailed with Henry Morgan continue to emerge from their watery grave. The legend of Port Royal serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly human civilization can vanish. In just 3 minutes, one of the most important cities in the Caribbean was erased from existence, taking with it countless stories, secrets, and lives. Whether its destruction was divine retribution, natural disaster, or something more mysterious, the lost city beneath the waves continues to captivate our imagination and challenge our understanding of the past.